Welcome everyone to our SecureKey webinar. Today we will be exploring the notion of digital identity with Andre Boysen, Executive Vice President of Marketing from SecureKey, and with our special guest speaker, Eve Mailer, Principal Analyst serving security and risk professionals from Forrester. We will be starting with an overview and introduction of the study. Over to you, Eve.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking with everyone today. So I'd like to just tell you a little bit about how this study was done regarding embracing a federated consumer identity model. So SecureKey asked Forrester Consulting to evaluate this challenge of handling consumer and citizen identity successfully and making it secure and trustworthy, and making users with it happy with it as well. So we actually tested that assertion, that hypothesis, by talking to both individual users through a survey and also IT professionals. So we surveyed 539 individuals, and we spoke with 12 IT professionals with responsibility for these IAM systems. So I'm not going to hold back on you. I want to share with you the three key findings that resulted from this effort. The first was that organizations' traditional IAM solutions are kind of feeling the strain, and they're failing these organizations for handling consumer and citizen identity successfully. We also found that individual users apply coping strategies. We talk about faux SSO here, faux single sign-on, that are also failing. They're failing them, they're failing the organizations. But we did find a willingness on the part of both of these populations to adopt new identity models. So the first thing that we found was that everybody's gaming the system and they're all really losing from the process. And there's, unfortunately, maybe no gambling house to take a percentage cut of what the organizations and the users are leaving behind. And this is affecting security and privacy and convenience. So let's take a look at some of the specifics here. One of the things we saw is that this sort of fake or faux single sign-on that users do actually gives websites security problems that they really can't fix all by themselves. So let's break this down. What you're seeing is we asked people in these 4 country regions approximately how many distinct online accounts do you have at various websites. And then we asked how many distinct passwords do you use to log in. So we're asking about password reuse unilaterally on the part of the user. And what you can see is it's about 2 to 1. So there's a fair amount of password reuse. The problem with this is that even with the password policies in place forcing users to come up with passwords, they are able to reuse enough of them that it poses a security risk to sites that are subject to a breach because some other password database on some other site was breached. So password policies actually are making it worse, especially if users visit the site infrequently. We actually found that in another result from this that users choose a strategy for selecting a password. So for example, in the US, 60% of users said, I pick something I'll remember that still meets the website's policy requirements. But then when you ask, how much trouble do you have remembering your passwords? 70% of our US respondents said, I tend to remember the ones I use frequently but forget the others. So you can see that it's not helping anyway. I also wanted to share with you a quote from one of the IT folks that we interviewed who's in e-commerce. They think that this is not sustainable. They said regarding their IAM policies, we do need to reconsider the current model because it's not sustainable. I hope new solutions will be available. It's getting harder to support customer identity, especially with the younger customer base. I thought that was quite interesting. So one of the next things that we learned is that users are really gaming themselves out of handling login properly. So what we see here is that users self-chose a security strategy, which is fudging their answers to security questions. That's on the right. So some users, up to 9% of users, basically picked fake answers to security questions, which are often used for account recovery. And we saw significant numbers on the left of people who have trouble remembering a password and failing with online recovery. So we're seeing that there's a tendency for users to pick security strategies that ultimately are a big fail. We also see problems when it comes to things like password reset. We talked to one IT professional who deals with a lot of car dealership employees, so kind of a near consumer use case. I think of this as B to lowercase b. It's really like consumers in the real world who aren't your employees, but they still have a business relationship with you, where all the employees in a car dealership would have a shared single account. And then if you need to do a password reset, it basically screws up the entire business's relationship with the larger company. Now, we looked at potential solutions to these problems. And you'd think that social sign-in has a great way to solve the problem. Look, you just outsource user management, you outsource authentication, you outsource account recovery. The challenge is that we didn't see a lot of user trust in the security and privacy online. And so on the right, what you're seeing is what users told us about their level of concern about online security and privacy. And what you're seeing on the left is one global financial services firm that said that, look, we're so regulated. We're completely regulated regarding every last little thing that you can think of. So if a social sign-in kind of site, like a social networking site, wants to present to us the opportunity of, hey, we'll handle your user management, we'll handle your login, it's not good enough for us. Another result that we saw, I didn't put up on the screen here, is we asked users about their perception of the security and privacy of websites, like social networks, consumer brand sites, news and blog sites, and entertainment sites. A maximum of 18% of users across all of the populations we looked at perceived there to be sufficient security and privacy in these accounts. So again, mutual distrust of these lightweight sites that are typically used for the social sign-in pattern where you might use a Facebook or a Google+. So what we ultimately concluded was that there is room for a federated identity approach when you inject security and privacy and trust considerations into the proposition. So the first thing that we saw was that organizations are already limiting their risk and liability in outsourcing something else, not identity data, but sensitive payment data. So I just wanted to share with you a quote, and this comes from an insurance company. When it comes to payments, one strategy we've used to keep information out of scope for PCI is just to pass the customer over to another system. That's a third-party system for payment. Going into scope for PCI just adds to our workload, so we keep credit cards off of our buy button. This is really an indication that this model of outsourcing to outsource liability is a viable one, and it should be viable for identity data as well as payment data. The second sign that we saw that there was interest in a federated approach is that the data that we already saw earlier shows that there could be a lot of benefit to not only to users, not only to sites who would be outsourcing, relying parties, as we call them in federated identity, but also identity providers, those to whom these processes are outsourced, if you do this pattern, this federated pattern. Just for one example, the identity provider site becomes higher touch, which means that users will remember passwords if that's all you're using to log them in. They get more used to whatever authentication method there is. That strengthens the ecosystem of security for all. Now, the next thing that we saw was that federation and strong authentication actually, as we already know, pair well. Basing a user session on a local password is acknowledged these days to be very weak. It's still weak if you're basing a federated interaction, a federated login session on a password somebody puts in somewhere else. So we want to look for signs that strong authentication is going to hit its stride. And in fact, we did see an interesting willingness among users to actually do things like locking their mobile phone, locking individual apps on a phone, and in particular using some biometric methods such as fingerprint or face recognition to do that unlocking. And we also saw some interesting strength in the possibility of sending a one-time code to your mobile phone or generated on a mobile app in addition to a password. So this is actually a very welcome sign. The next thing that we think is evidence that this is a productive approach, that is to say, go to a trustworthy, secure, private identity provider, is the fact that users are telling us that they trust the security and privacy of a select few sites that would be candidates to be identity providers. So when we looked at, well, what's your perception of the security and privacy of bank and financial services and government sites, a minimum among the different geographical populations that we surveyed of 53%, over half, that was, by the way, in the U.S. market, which tends to be the most distrustful, expressed a perception of security and privacy trust. That's in bank and financial sites and government sites. And then finally, one of the things that we think was really the kicker for why there'd be interest in a federated identity approach is that when we look at the choices that users make when account recovery goes wrong are really, really bad for the business. So what we saw was that if they followed the site's instructions for resetting a password online or through email, they tended to have some success. But here in rank order were the things they did next versus having success in online account recovery. The next most common thing they did was call the company's customer support phone line. Well, we know how expensive that is and how unhappy it makes both sides. So that's not a good solution. The next most popular was stopped using the service. That is really not a good answer if what you do is sell things to people online or want to engage with people online. The next most common answer was re-enrolled and got a new account. So this is a really interesting one. It's not always possible, for example, in the case of a citizen EID where you make sure that a single real-world person is behind a single account. But in a lot of cases, you know, e-commerce cases, a lot of cases out there, marketing cases, if your password recovery method is so onerous that people would rather create a new account, now you've got a problem on the back end figuring out if you wanted to market to these people, now you really have a problem knowing who's who. And then the last thing that they chose was to use in-branch services or just phone-based services for doing what they would have done online instead. And these are the most expensive possible options for them. So those really do present problems to the business. And so we saw that there may be a ripe time right now for actually improving this. So here's what recommendations we came up with after doing these surveys and doing these extensive interviews. First thing is, you've really got to look at your path forward for consumer or citizen IAM. Really, you have to really consider it carefully. The first choice you have is do what you've been doing. It's pretty much siloed, and it's perhaps less secure than you think. I'll mention some information on that in a second. Another choice is to become a relying party, to accept identities from trusted sources. This puts the onus on managing identities and managing login routinely and managing account recovery on what was a cost center in your organization to a profit center, potentially, that essentially cloud identity provider. You could also become a trusted source of those identities yourself. And that's something that is really viable to think about if you control a user base and have really high security policies that you execute on and you're already a trusted source of identity. Talk about that more in a second as well. The second thing that we recommend is, you know, don't keep doing what's often now called security theater. That's a term that Bruce Schneier came up with. If you've got a bad authentication strategy, you really want to think about ways in which your security isn't as strong as you thought. Excuse me. So one of the things that we saw in talking to folks was that, let me find my notes on this, we talked to a financial services provider, and it was really interesting what we found there. They basically didn't trust anybody else to have as high security policies as they themselves have and practices in security hygiene. They are distrustful of social sites because, oh my God, they're so insecure and we're so regulated. But the way that they authenticate their users is username and password, and they use security questions as, quote, multi-factor. I submit to you that is not multi-factor, it's more secrets. And security questions are secrets that have many, many of the same security and, by the way, also usability weaknesses as passwords. So there's a disconnect between the security they think they have and the security they actually have. Finally, if you're looking to source identities from trustworthy sources, think outside the box of who could be an identity provider. The go-to examples, and I know we'll hear from Andre in a moment about some concrete examples, include banks, telecommunications companies, government EIDs where that is used, also maybe utilities, which know where you live. Also, let me suggest to you to think about civil societies, the .orgs of the world that have an online presence and have a user base of interest to you, as well as not social networks, but professional networks. Those tend to be really quite interesting. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention to this part of the program, and I want to turn it over to Andre.
Eve, thank you very much. That was very insightful and a very good presentation of what you've put together in the Forrester Research paper on this topic. So I just want to take it a little bit further now, maybe just talk about how we see things evolving in the industry and just looking at the landscape of how the problems are being manifested for users and web services and maybe what we can do about it. So with that, I'd like to, big in popular culture is, there we go. Big in popular culture is the dog cartoon. There's a very funny cartoon, and I believe it came out by New Yorker that kind of said that, the great thing about the internet is that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And that is interesting in that what we realize from that is the internet really is an anonymous authentication technology, and there's really no way to know anything about anybody for real. And so a more germane way to put that cartoon is to say is that with enough information, anyone on the internet can be you, because it's all based on secrets. And so secrets are user IDs and passwords. They're knowledge-based questions, which, as we heard from Eve a second ago, people are fudging because they know that anybody who knows me well knows my secrets, so they're fudging their secrets to try and protect themselves. And then we've got a situation where also that we know as users that we're being asked to comply with these things that we're not going to do. You said, internet hygiene is this concept that I'm going to make my passwords long and hairy. I'm going to change them. I'm not going to make them the same across sites, and I promise to change them frequently. And of course, I'm doing none of those things. So I'm lying to all the web services that I'm using. And even more, I'm lying when I say I've read the user agreement and I understand the privacy policy. So the whole thing is kind of a whole set of lies. And so there's no wonder there's no trust in the system, because users are fearful and understand how it works on some level, and so they're trying to protect themselves in other ways. And they do that by fudging, and they also do it by limiting how much information they disclose. So here's the thing that's interesting. From a user point of view, I want to get access to a service, and in order for the web service to serve me, they've got to have a certain level of business certainty that it's really me. And so what's happening is now with so many web services in my life, I've got all of these web services innovating and creating new authentication mousetraps. And so in my personal life, I've got LastPass as a service I use for password management, and with them, I've got to use this service called Twofer to do second factor on my phone. I use PayPal. I use PayPal for some of the transactions in my life, and with that thing, I've got a Yubico token that I've got to carry around with me. With Google, I've got the Google Authenticator on my phone. And with Twitter, they send me SMS messages so they know it's really me. And then I've got the bank in my life. My bank, who's in really the best place to serve me in all of these places, is asking me dumb questions on my smartphone. What they're doing is basically asking me knowledge-based questions, which, for the life of me, I can't remember. And so it's getting really hard for users to navigate all these authentication mousetraps that they're encountering. So what I want is somebody who can actually know it's really me and help me get to the places I want to go. That's what each of us as users of the internet is crying out for. So if that's user space, let's look at it from web space. To a web service, serving customers online feels a lot like the Matrix. You've got 100 people running at you saying, my name is Andre Boyson and I want access. And it's very hard for any web service, banks, or anyone to really get high certainty of who it is. And so you've got the real user trying to get in, and you've got 100 sock puppets masquerading as the user, each one trying to get access to my account. And so that's why we're having all these authentication mousetraps. The business that's trying to serve me, trying to get some level of certainty, it's really me and not someone pretending to be me. So that's kind of what's happening from a web service space. So this is the challenge. To the extent that it's hard for banks, I'd say it's triply hard for government to serve online. Banks have the benefit of dealing with me often and having a large branch network where I can go to if I have troubles getting access to my account. When you look at many web services, things like government and municipal, federal, and provincial services as an example, the challenge they have is they would love to serve on the internet. The challenge for them, though, is that I don't go there very often. And so when I come there, I've often forgotten my password. And so from a government point of view, it's very hard to have business certainty that it's my user when every time I show up, I'm a password reset. As a consequence, government tends to put very low value or very simple things on the internet, things like download a PDF form that I can then print out and then bring into the branch. And so that's what's happening. And so as a user, if I go through all the trouble of getting a user ID and password for a government service or any other service I don't go to frequently, and I get there only to find out I can't accomplish what was on my to-do list today, I get very frustrated. And I divert to a higher cost channel. And I will never come back to your online channel because I know it doesn't serve any of my needs. And so I divert to the branch or to the call center or to mail or places that are more expensive for government to serve. And so that's kind of this double-barreled conundrum that many web services find themselves in, is that they want higher business assurance but can't get it because they don't have the frequency of touch with the user. So what that relates to is how identity works. And today we have two worlds. We have Street ID, which I have in my wallet and I use to accomplish all sorts of things. And I have digital ID, and right now the internet really feels like the matrix, and it's all based on secrets, and users have kind of reached the limits of what they can manage here. It's interesting that I can accomplish everything I need to do in my real life with the 6 cards I have in my wallet, yet everywhere I go on the internet they're saying, here's a new user ID and password. So let's just examine how maybe we can fix that. So let's think about this for a second. We've had payment cards in our wallets for a long time. Credit cards and debit cards have worked quite well for a long time for street purchases. But they've been a little bit weaker on the internet. And so in a lot of ways, your credit card number is another secret that you're trying to manage on the internet. And the secret attached to your credit card is the little number on the back and perhaps your mailing address. And so that's led to a lot of fear and also fraud on the online channel. And so there's been a lot of innovation on the online channel where we see companies like PayPal and Google and Amazon doing very, very innovative payment mechanisms on the internet, which doesn't require the user to reveal so much personal information. And so we've got two payment worlds. But what's interesting to me is that each is trying to get into the other space. So the street payment players have been very innovative now, recognizing that they have to get better at online payments, and they're looking at strategies like tokenization so they can do a better service for payments online. In reverse, we see the online guys like Apple and PayPal coming up with this notion of beacons that they're going to stick in the store so that when you walk into the store, your phone's going to say welcome, and an offer that is available is going to show up on your phone, and you can actually pre-purchase and just pick things up in the store. So what that says really is that your online experience and your digital experience for payments are going to become the same. And so that's kind of interesting. The other thing that's related, though, is when you think about it, payments and identity often go together. And so when you look at identity, street identity, I have 3 to 6 cards in my wallet that I use to accomplish all sorts of online tasks. In-person tasks. I use them to get on the plane, when I check into a hotel, when I want to rent a car, get a new cell phone, get a bank account, all these things, even to vote. I use the stuff in my wallet. Yet on the internet, everywhere I go, I get a special purpose card, if I can call it that in this context. So there's an opportunity there to really innovate and allow users to start using a set of trusted providers to reach all of their online destinations, instead of getting a dedicated credential for every place that they go. And so our thesis here is that like payments, street identity and digital ID are going to become the same. And so that's really our market view, and that's how we're approaching the marketplace. And here's just to reinforce this point. It's interesting when you think about it. You can use your payment card, a bank card here from Canada or from the U.S., and you can go to any ATM on the planet and take cash out. And as a user, you kind of get, when I use my the MasterCard as we have my example here, that my target bank that I go to, maybe if I'm visiting Barclays in London, I understand that Barclays doesn't get to look in my bank account or see any of my transaction details on a go-forward basis. So there's a built-in privacy notion that users kind of have a concept of here. And that's kind of the model we're trying to propagate in identity and authentication, is that users can use a single credential at lots of destinations, and they're not going to have to give up their privacy in the course of doing it. And that's really what our company is all about, is building trusted identity networks that scale like payment networks, but still allow users to accomplish their online tasks and preserve privacy. And so where we are today is, as Eve kind of said, is today the truth is that every web service on the planet has already rolled out their silo authentication infrastructure. They did it because they had to. But, like it makes no sense for every business to run its own hydro generator. We're in a situation now where, there's going to be a specialization in the marketplace. We're going to see those providers who have high frequency and an ongoing relationship with their customers become a trusted provider to help their users reach all sorts of places on the internet. And then there's those who have lower touch services. While the services are valuable, the users don't come on a frequent basis. They're going to be better served by buying a credential that the user has in their wallet already. And that's really what this model is all about. As authentication moves to the edges into providers and subscribers, we believe that the middle is going to crumble. It won't be cost effective for you to run your own authentication infrastructure anymore, and more to the point, your users are going to demand that they be able to use a credential that they have already. So here's an example that I want to talk about that's been working in Canada for about 2 years now. So the government of Canada had this challenge that I talked about a few minutes ago. They know who I am in paper, but when I show up on the internet, they have a hard time authenticating me. And so they had very low business assurance in delivering government services online in Canada. And so what they were searching for was a mechanism that allowed Canadians to show up for government services online with a credential that they had already. And the basic notion here is that it had to have scale, so they have to cover the entire Canadian population, and with a strong level of assurance. LOA2 is what the model is all about. And so that's what we did. We worked with them to develop a service that does exactly that, and at the same time manages user privacy. So let me just talk about how that works for one moment. So the basic notion now is that Canadians can use credentials from the set of providers that you see on the left. In this case, all banks. It doesn't have to be banks, but we believe those are good anchors. Telcos are good anchors too, and he gave some other good examples that would fit well in a model like this. So using a credential provider that I have a relationship with already, I can use this now to reach over 120 government destinations in Canada. So if I want to get access to my tax information or my health benefits information, or enroll my companies, these are all things now I can do with the credential that I have already, rather than the government of Canada having to provision me with a special purpose user ID and password. And similarly, there's good examples of things like this going on in other countries. U.S. government has been running a strategy they call the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, which is given birth to many pilots. One of the pilots is with U.S. Postal, where they're going to explore a model very much like the one I just talked about. And also in the UK, there's a lot of work being done to explore how federated consumer identity can be accomplished, and so too in other markets around the world. And so with that, I'd like to wrap up my portion, and I'd like to invite Dave Motti, our Director of Product Marketing, to come in and have a discussion with both Eve and I and our audience about what we just went through.
Excellent. Thanks, Andre, and thanks, Eve. I think you guys did a really good job today, and I think certainly I can comment myself, having personal issues, with a lot of this stuff, right? Just going to all these different sites, and I know sometimes when I'm signing up for a new service and I get something like, oh, hey, why don't you create a new ID? Or, you know what, why don't you leverage your LinkedIn account or leverage your Facebook account? So it's pretty interesting, and I think, certainly this is the time when I think a lot of service providers need to ask that question. Should we invest more in our own identity infrastructure, or should we look at leveraging others? On a quick administrative note, I think what we're just about to do is post up some poll questions. So if you guys want to go through, those are done in real time. So there's going to be about 3 poll questions we're going to post up. They're multiple choice, so just go ahead and kind of select your answers, and we'll try to get those towards the end of the session. But I'm going to go ahead and we'll kick off the the moderated session here. So Eve, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned that you talked to about 12 organizations that you interviewed. So what kind of services do they offer online today, and kind of what do they tell you?
It was really interesting. So we actually talked to 3 different bank and financial companies. We talked to a couple different folks, actually 3 different parties in government. One of them was sort of county level, one of them was sort of state level or province level, and another one was an individual government agency. We talked to a heavy equipment manufacturer. We talked to an online vehicle auction site, an e-commerce company that also has a bricks and mortar presence, and an insurance company, which I guess worth distinguishing from the bank sites because they're regulated differently, and then finally a telecommunications company. So really broad. Some observations about what I heard from them, it was they were struggling with a lot of siloing. So they already within their own organizations have dozens or sometimes hundreds of apps that they're managing for identity-enabled access, and they're doing it in a patchwork of ways. So they've already got an internal problem. Even internal federation would start to solve some of their problems. The next observation I had was I would ask them, well, do you know how much it costs you? They have no idea in most cases. And yeah, it was really interesting and surprising. And so when I see the cloud models that are arising of utility-based pricing, something like, N amount of money per user per month or something, I actually think that would be a relief to them hearing what they were telling me. And as I mentioned, the anecdote of this one fellow on the financial site who told me they have strong regulations, they have high standards for security, they're pretty sure no IDP in the world could meet it, and yet they use username, password security questions, and they consider that to be strong authentication, and I have to beg to differ.
It's interesting and you mentioned it earlier on in the webcast, right? The security theater point, which in some cases, right, we all get the view that maybe the way that we are doing certain things is the right way. But as we know, and obviously with all these breaches that have happened, and obviously the usability issues, it's obviously a problem when using just usernames and passwords.
It's a great time to reopen that conversation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, great. Andre, so I know we obviously went over a lot of information about users and their online habits. But when you step back from that, what does that say about, us and kind of you?
Well, I came to the conclusion, and I talked about Eve about this after we completed the paper and we had a bit of soak time. In some respects, I kind of feel like we buried the lead. What the data says to me here is actually very interesting. The user data here provides the most compelling business case there is for credential federation. Users have voted with their passwords and their actions for their own federation. They want simpler access, and they're willing to do it themselves if they need to. So where we are today in Internet architecture is do-it-yourself, single sign-on. The truth is, users cope by copying. And so I think there's both a duty and an opportunity to innovate here. It's clear this is what users want, but nobody stepped in to serve them better. And so this is really what the discussion today is all about, is talking about how we can help users anchor their single sign-on in a single place rather than trying to do it all on their own. And that's really what the conversation is all about, David.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting actually, Eve, your colleague there, Andras, I know, and I've had some conversations with him just on authentication and going back to the notion of do-it-yourself and what users are doing out there in the wild. You can never underestimate their ingenuity, and I know Andras talked about people in the enterprise space gluing their RSA tokens or their hard tokens to their laptops.
Yes.
I love the one when he talked about. It was a company in Europe where people would take smart cards, right? And you would say that's a great authenticator, inserting it into their laptops for the contact type readers that are embedded, cutting off the end of the card and putting electrical tape on. So I think, it's really an interesting notion when you put stuff out there to users, what your users will end up doing with it.
Well, and in fact, in a case where it's consumers and they have choice and they're not captive, remember that if their interests do not align with your interests as a website operator, they will find ways around. They are the king. So we need to find ways that satisfy them.
Sorry, go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, I just want to get in. That's actually a really, really important point. So I know in my personal case, I actually have 100 user IDs and passwords. And what I'm not willing to do is get 100 cards that I got to carry around. I'm going to hate that even more. And so even in my lead-in, there was the example I talked about, all these second factors things that I'm trying out. Now, I will give you the point that I probably have an authentication pathology. I'm playing around with all of these authentication things to see how they work. But we've got to understand that users have limits to what they're willing to do here. And what I'm not going to do is train myself on how to do dedicated authentication for every web service that I go to. So standardization here is going to be important. And also getting it down to a smaller set of things that users actually have to manage is also going to be very, very important.
Indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So actually, I'm going to just change gears a little bit, and I'm going to ask one of the poll questions. So first up, let me read the question, and then I'll pose it to one of you guys, or you guys can just fight over it, if you will. What is your current view of credential acceptance from social media sites? And we gave our audience kind of three options here. So we said, first option is our service accepts them already. The second option is we've thought about it, we might do it. The third is we thought about it, it's not something we're going to do. And the last, I don't know what you're talking about. So the results, that's interesting.
I'll make a quick,
go ahead, Eve. Yeah.
But just a quick comment that, choosing the answer C, we've thought about it, it's not a path we will pursue, is absolutely consistent with the conversations I had with these dozen folks in the business of having secure websites.
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like it's jiving with what you talked about earlier in the discussion and what kind of the research reflects as well. So, Andre, I don't know if you had any comments on that.
So it's interesting that users are kind of voting for this in some sense. They're seeing it and self-selecting it as a mechanism. So clearly, they see it as a way to get rid of the burden of otherwise having another user ID and password. What's important to understand here is that today, though social media is not really fit for the purpose of high level of assurance use cases, I'm quite happy to use my Facebook account as an example to pair it with my travel site, because I'm not too concerned about what's in that particular web service and what exposures it has for me as a user. But I think we're a long way away from using Facebook to change title on a house. And so where we need to be is in a place where, as a user, I can prove my identity on the internet when I want to. And what's going to happen is one of two things. Either the current model continues and slowly the social media sites climb the fit for acceptance curve themselves, or trust providers that are already in the marketplace step in and serve me better. So it's going to be one of those two paths in the future, and our goal is to try and get to a trusted future where users have more choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of on that notion, I'm going to go to the second poll question. And we posed the question to the audience: do you have concerns or issues with how users behave when using their credentials today? So password sharing, password strength, right, the type of authenticator, all that kind of stuff, and then password resets and the kind of lifecycle management there. We gave them kind of three options: yes, no, and not sure. And it seems like overwhelmingly 92% said yes. So I don't know what your comment is on that. But.
This data seems to be a little uncertain. I'm not sure what it means. No, clearly there's a problem with how we're doing things today.
Yeah, exactly. I think we all know that, but it's funny that we're still kind of sitting ducks in the water, right? I mean, we've been dealing with this stuff, but we haven't really, done these things on the side, but no one's really kind of done anything that's really impacted the market as a whole. Okay, and I'm going to do the last one here. If a service were available today with trusted credential providers for your users, would you use it? We gave them three options: yes, no, and maybe. And this one's interesting. It's not as overwhelming as the last one. 50% said they would. 4% said no, and 46% said maybe.
Interesting.
It's encouraging. I mean, I take this as further evidence, obviously anecdotal evidence or not, statistically significant, but further evidence to the point that we found doing this research, which was that there's a willingness to explore new options. So it seems that we're really at an important choice point right now in history. Old methods don't work, so the problem space is there. Solution space has been maybe lacking in some specifics, but we're starting to see some solutions that point the way to the answer.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Eve. I'd say what that says to me is that services kind of are open to the idea, but they haven't seen it yet. And so when they see it, they'll know it, and there'll be a rush to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it may not be linear. It may very well be there's going to be a dam breaking with, perhaps the Canadian example, which I find very interesting.
Yeah. And it's getting the right model in place, and what we've seen is with many of these types of services, once the right set of circumstances come together, there's a big rush to go that way.
Yeah, and just I know when I've gone out and kind of when you talked about what the pilots in the U.S. and what's going on in Canada, one of the questions comes up, and this I'm going to first pose to you, Andre, is the concentration risk, right? So right now, I mean, with all of these different IDs, you could argue that, well, hopefully if I'm not doing do-it-yourself SSO and I'm actually choosing different passwords for my sites, if one of them gets hacked, I'm okay because that, they might not get access to everything else. So it's really around the concentration risk. Like, isn't it risky to have too many sites hooked up to a single credential?
That's an interesting question, and it's one we encounter a lot. My response to it, though, is I think the risk is an illusion for a few reasons. The first is that it's clear that users are copying anyway. We've got do-it-yourself single sign-on. That's what users are in fact doing. And so the idea that we're protected by having it all separated out in different places actually is an illusion because users are making it all the same. So whatever belief as a web service we have by having strong rules are being undone by the user's behavior to trying to make their life easier. And so that's the first point. The second point I would say is that when you look at payment networks, we have concentration in the form of cards. And those cards are actually turn out to be not a risk, but actually an accelerator. The reason commerce works so well is because it's easy for me to get payments at the places that I go to. It's not they're not trying to say, invent a new payment ritual when I go to a merchant. And so that's why e-commerce works so well and store works so well. So that's the second point. But the third point is actually the most important point. So let's say, I've got a whole set of web services in my life, and some new service comes out. Fundservice.com gets going. So for whatever reason, I decide that I'm going to use the same user ID and password that I use at Facebook. And so the challenge is when fundservice.com, not having the same level of scale and rigor as a large web service, gets breached. They get my user ID and password. And then the consequence of that is my Facebook and my Twitter account and a bunch of other things get breached too because I made them the same. And so what's important to recognize here is that the credential management business is one of scale and rigor, and it's very hard to do when you're a small service. And so when you couple together small service with user behavior, we actually have greater risk with a spread authentication scheme. And so where we need to get to is having a single trust anchor that the user chooses. So each of us can choose our own trusted provider. And so that's kind of how the payment model works. I have my trusted provider, Eve has her trusted provider, and you have your trusted provider for payments. And we each can get to the same set of destinations with that model. And so we want to bring that same notion here to authentication and identity so that users can get access to services more easily online.
Yeah.
So that I just want to add a second point though here, just to close it off. So we really do need to move the internet beyond secrets if we're ever going to make it safer. And so a contrast I'd like to bring up is my Facebook account, which has access to nothing that's important to me in a consequential way. It's important at a family level, but not in a meaningful asset way. So they've got a set of rules like every other web service, and it's an 8-character user ID and password. By contrast, my bank card, which has access to all my money, only has a 4-digit PIN. And on the surface, that sounds crazy. You'd think the banks would be losing money hand over fist, but they're not. And the reason is this. The security model for the card is anchored in the card. It's not anchored in the password, which means that we can make a 4-digit PIN on the card and make it easier access for users. And so that's the insight. If we can actually start anchoring the internet in things that users always carry, then we can make the ability for them to get access to services that much easier. I can make an easy PIN, and it's not that much of an issue. And that's really where we need to go with all of this, is making it easier for users. Today we have a scheme that's hard for users and easy for crooks, and we need to invert the model so it's hard for crooks and easy for users.
I wanted to comment just one thing on that. I think it's a very interesting insight that this centralization risk is actually an illusion. In the payment world, of course, the interests do align because the card issuers want users to do more transactions. They want to use that credential more often, if you will, if we use the analogy to identity. And they also have the responsibility to take care of fraud risk. So there's upside, there's business upside potential, and there's downside risk potential, and the banks themselves are in the best position because they're large and centralized to have a kind of multi-tenant view, if you will. They're sort of a cloud provider of payment services. So they see a lot of threats, and they're in the best position to mitigate threats because it's their bottom line that's affected. So I think that model is a very powerful one for figuring out how to do this for identity.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that is definitely a fairly common, gut response that people say, hey, we're just consolidating, putting your eggs into one basket, if you will. But I think definitely that kind of answers that concern. So I'm just going to switch gears here a little bit, and what we're going to do now is move away from the kind of the discussion, and I'm going to take some questions from the audience. We actually have a good number of them to begin. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll just kind of take questions for kind of the remainder of the webcast. So the first one actually is for Eve, and it's you mentioned that at most 18% of people trust the security of social media sites for security and privacy. Is that documented in the study somewhere? And that's thanks, and that was somebody from the Alberta government, and they wanted to point out that they're a Forrester customer.
Oh, very nice. Love to hear that. Yes, that comes from the thought leadership paper that Forrester Consulting produced in concert with SecureKey. So, in fact, that is in the paper that I believe you can download maybe from this very panel here. So that is in the paper. I just didn't want to overwhelm with a lot of numbers and charts on the slides in case they were not very visible. So that's in there.
Okay. Do you think this transition will happen on a global scale or in pockets? I likely assume that what that question means is do we think that we'll just see things like Canada happen isolated from other parts of the world, or do we actually think this is going to be some kind of transition that might just happen altogether?
You want me to take that one?
Why don't you start, Eve, and then I'll follow in.
Sounds good. So every range, I think, is possible of ecosystem side. It could be global. I mean, Facebook is already serving as a global identifier for lots of purposes. And as I saw talking to so many folks who are just looking to unsilo the applications they have within their own organization, there's room for an internal federation process that functions much the same as it would on a global scale. But I think that there are going to be ecosystems where a certain credential, a certain identity is going to be appropriate and where it's not. Like there's places where I choose to use LinkedIn versus some social thing. To log into clout.com with a K, in case you guys know that, I use my Twitter account because that's what I'm interested to know is my influence on Twitter. So it makes sense in that case. But, in other cases, I might want to use my professional network identity or even my Forrester identity, which I do in some cases.
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying that there are natural communities that need to federate already. And so I think this is going to happen by places that have a natural need to do this already, and where we're starting to see friction or limits to growth because of the authentication problem in these groups. There's a natural space for e-government services. I think it's a very, very good place to take this. Health services would be another. In the U.S. and Canada, getting access to electronic health records for patients online continues to be an authentication challenge. In order to be able to deliver health records online safely, we would have to have a very strong password. It would have to be 120 characters, have ejection glyphs in it, and change every 20 seconds in order to meet the security hurdle. And so I think there's an opportunity here to actually bring it into things that users carry already. And provinces, BC is leading here as an example by putting out a card that actually has a chip inside, so users can do strong authentication with a card and have simpler access with a PIN. So we're seeing innovation at the government level, in Canada in the provincial level. And then as I look internationally, the U.S. government is working very, very hard to find private-public partnership models that allow this to grow, and it's so too in UK, and there's good leadership in Australia as well. So I think it's going to happen with natural communities of interest, and eventually these communities will federate with each other. I want to add a secondary comment is that just in the evolution of the federation space, federation has been around for a long, long time, but federation has always been enterprise-oriented. It's been about enterprises giving access to employees inside the enterprise to all the apps, and increasingly now to getting out to the cloud. And I'd call that all outbound federation. And what SecureKey is doing is a different category of federation, what we would categorize as inbound federation, which is to say, rather than giving your user a new user ID and password from the enterprise, let the user bring in a credential that they have already. So the next wave of innovation and federation is going to be this notion of inbound federation.
Just another question that I think kind of flows on that. So someone asked a question, you offer SecureKey Concierge as a quote-unquote new solution. How are you different than a social media site? Obviously, you're more secure, but in what ways? So, Andre, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so I'd say it's different in a couple of different ways. One is that, importantly, for government to get business assurance, they want to know that the person presenting online is a real person. And so the first difference is in fit for purpose. The difference between the banks and social media as being an anchor for trust service like this is that banks have met every single one of their customers in person, and every customer account that's been created has been done under a regulated process known as Know Your Client. By contrast, social media has actually met none of their customers in person. So there's a big contrast there in terms of the level of business assurance in the enrollment. So that's difference one. A difference two is the privacy model that's in place. So today, when I use my social media profile at a second site, the second site gets complete access to my entire social profile. And so, as a user, it may not necessarily be aware that's actually true, and that's one of the findings in the study that we have with Forrester here. That's the first point. And the second point is, as a user, I'm not sure they need to have all the data. So the second big difference in how the service operates is what we call triple blind. So although I'm using my bank account to get to government, there is no joint profile. The bank and the government are not talking about my combined picture together. It works very differently from that. It works more like the payment example I gave a few minutes ago. So when I want to get access to the Canada Revenue Agency, our tax authority, I go to CRA and say, hey, I want to get in today, please. At that point, as the user, I'm presented the SecureKey Concierge menu, and I choose a provider from the trusted providers in the menu. So the newest provider is the ING, so maybe I select my ING account as the mechanism I want to use to bind to my account. So I then get taken over to ING, and I authenticate with ING the same way I do every day when I use my ING account. Having passed my authentication test with ING, ING will actually then produce an anonymous security token. This security anonymous token is given back to SecureKey and re-anonymize it and give it back to CRA. And so what CRA has gotten is an anonymous security token. And so they're going to be in one of two states. Either they've seen this token before and they're going to say, hi, Andre, welcome back. Or if they haven't, they're going to proceed to do an online account open in the same way they would do today prior to our services being in existence. And then having satisfied themselves that I'm Andre, then bind it to my account. So importantly, the difference is that the service is triple blind, which is to say that the government didn't get to see the details of my bank account or which bank I came from. In reverse, the bank didn't get to see my government destination and the service I was accessing. And the service, SecureKey Concierge, doesn't know who you are. So none of the transaction participants got a complete picture of the user journey, and we think that's a great story for user privacy.
Excellent. Excellent. Eve, I'm going to pass this one to you. And then, Andre, if you can comment if you like as well. What about using a low security social login as initial authentication, then stepping up to a different credential as the relationship with the consumer proceeds? Wouldn't this lower the barrier to capturing a customer and possibly make account recovery easier too? So that was another interesting question from our audience here.
Yeah, indeed. So I do see this model in a few cases, more often facing consumers, but occasionally facing employees of partner companies as well, where you sort of onboard a user in a more seamless fashion than you would have had to with a local account enrollment by leveraging an existing, basically a Facebook cookie that's already on the person's machine. And then either use that for a one-time onboarding process and then creating a local account from there on, or using it as a routine first step in what amounts to a kind of multi-step authentication process. So in the employee case that I saw, this was kind of a joint venture. The employee of the partner company would log in through, it could be Facebook or even the partner company's IDP or whatever, and then they would have an additional one-time password challenge once they got to the ultimate application. And so what you can think of this as is almost like a partial relying party. You're relying on some features but not all. I don't think that you're not really outsourcing 100% of the problem in that case. So you bear responsibility for more of the user lifecycle management than you would have otherwise, and you couldn't necessarily, if you wanted to go for a higher level of assurance, that's an awfully hard way to do trust elevation every time the user logs in. So I'm not sure that it's actually viable for a truly high assurance credential because it's too distributed, but it's an interesting model that I think people can leverage in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So the industry term for that technique is called trust elevation. And another way of thinking of it is a credential mashup. So just basically take a bunch of things users already and put it together, right? So it's interesting as a way to actually innovate and create new schemes. So I think that's important because it's going to allow us to find the right mix of things that work well for users. The only caution I have in proceeding that way is it goes back to the authentication issue I was raising earlier, is that what I don't want is users that have every website I go to dreaming up some new way to authenticate me. As a user, I hate that. And for me, is all friction and mousetraps, and I hate getting all these authentication wounds because I've forgotten the authentication trick I got to use at this website. So there's limits to what it can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we've got time for, we'll try and squeeze in two, but likely one. So we've got one here. This could be to both of you guys. Do you see any real interest by U.S. banks to move beyond shared secrets such as passwords and challenge questions for consumer authentication? Might the authentication standards being developed by the FIDO Alliance make any difference? And do you see any evidence that U.S. banks see a business model for themselves to act as identity providers? So a lot of questions kind of wrapped up together, but Eve, Andre, I'll let you guys take that.
I can take a run at it first, and then Andre can comment if that sounds okay. A lot of things packed into there. The banks that I've spoken to for this research definitely recognize that security questions were too weak for account recovery, and several folks were putting in place something like an emailed link that lets you go reset the password, which I believe has some stronger security properties. But in the main, the maturity level is surprisingly low. Now, a lot of banks, partly because of the FFIEC regulations or similar in various countries, will put in place risk-based authentication, which I think can be quite effective. FIDO Alliance is a whole long topic. I'll just shorten it by saying I'm encouraged by the element of it that might produce tighter user-to-mobile device, in particular, bindings, so that you can use that as a great start to an authentication chain. And finally, about identity providers, I'll just say that banks tend to be a little bit I don't want to use the word sclerotic, conservative, which makes sense, but you can point to things like login with PayPal as an example of a bank-like company doing it already.
Yeah, so I just want to build on that. The first thing I'd say is that FIDO is an important element, and we're a FIDO member for sure. What FIDO really is Bluetooth for devices. So I compare a device I bought in the store with a web service, and they can get a strong binding, much like I do with my phone with my car. So that's what FIDO is all about, and we encourage and support that. But importantly, going back to my comments that I said earlier, the irony is of all the web services that I have access to, the bank is actually in the position to serve me best. And so they continue, though, ironically, to ask me dumb questions on my smartphone. I have an app on my phone from my bank. If we just, took it a little bit further, and this is something we can actually do at SecureKey with our platform, is we can actually push an authentication event from the phone to the call center, so I can show up as an authenticated user rather than me today typing in my 16-digit client code into the phone and then putting in my PIN and then having waited through the voicemail, then repeating all that information again to the call center agent, then to get a bunch of dumb questions. So what we've got to do for banks here is actually help them make the authentication experience for the customers same across all their channels. So as a customer, it's easier for me everywhere, and then the banks can serve me better at the bank, and they can also help me at better places on the internet. And so to answer the question you really asked, is there interest in U.S. banks in doing it, we have some direct evidence that the answer is yes, and we hope that that continues.
Excellent. Well, I think that kind of concludes our discussion and Q&A section. Sarah, I'm going to kick it back over to you to kind of end off the webcast. So thanks again.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. So thank you, everyone, today for attending. You can find a copy of the paper and the slides in the attachment section of the BrightTalk platform. Additionally, you can also visit the URL that is posted on the slide, and I will also post it in the discussion window to download all of the materials. We'd also like to take a moment and invite you out to our breakfast seminar on January the 10th at the Toronto Board of Trade. Seating is limited, so please register if you plan to attend. And additionally, we had a lot of questions, and if yours didn't get answered, please feel free to email me, and I will put in my email address in the message window, and I will make sure Andre or Eve reply to your questions. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks all.